Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, both in person and on Zoom hybrid. Let me start by thanking Professor Carole McGranahan for joining us at the Refugee Seminar Series, and thanking the capable help of Teresa Delgado for arranging this visit. It is a really wonderful honor to have Carole join. She's been a mentor, and she's one of the stars of anthropology and refugee studies. Professor McGranahan is a cultural anthropologist and historian specializing in contemporary Tibet. Her research focuses on issues of colonialism and empire, history and memory, power and politics, refugees and citizenship, nationalism, senses of belonging, gender, war, and anthropology as theoretical storytelling. Since '94, she has conducted research in Tibetan refugee communities in India and Nepal on the history and politics of guerrilla resistance between 1950 and 1974, which culminated in her book, Arrested Histories, Tibet, the CIA, and Histories of a Forgotten War. It came out in 2010 with Duke University Press. Thinking of 20th and 21st century Tibetan histories and experiences as imperial in a global sense is a key part of her work in relation to the CIA, British India, and the People's Republic of China. Professor McGranahan's work on empire beyond Europe can be found in an edited volume, Imperial Formations, which came out in 2007. It was co-edited by Ann Stoller and Peter Perdue as well, and in Ethnographies of US Empire, which came out in 2018, co-edited with John Collins. Currently, Professor McGranahan is completing a book about the Pangdat thank you, family, Tibet and British India in the first half of the 20th century. And she's finishing a decade of research in France, India, Nepal, New York City, Switzerland, and Toronto, titled Refugee Citizenship, Asylum, Refusal, and Political Subjectivity in the Tibetan Diaspora. She's presenting from that research today a talk titled Refusal as Political Practice, an Ethnography of Citizenship and Refugee Status. Please help me welcome her today.
I'd like to say thank you to Ada Pepe and to everyone at Yale for inviting me to be here. It's my pleasure to be able to share this research with you. So the first time I went to Toronto, all everyone was talking about was political asylum and gaining convention refugee status. But people weren't just talking about it, they were joking about it. There was one joke we heard everywhere we went. It went something like this. Have you heard about the Sherpa guy who posed as a Tibetan in asylum court? The judge asked him when the Dalai Lama's birthday was, and the man answered, Saturday? Everyone who told the joke roared with laughter at the punchline. Yep. No matter how many times it was told to Kaesung and me, in this friend's apartment or that one, Kaesung would laugh so hard she had to wipe away tears. The joke was funny because, of course, every Tibetan knows that the Dalai Lama's birthday was July 6th. Yet in India and Nepal, his birthday is usually not celebrated exactly on the 6th, but instead is celebrated on Saturday, which is kind of the national holiday, kind of the one-day holiday, right, in a 6-day work week, the Bida, the Chuti. While all Tibetans know this, they also know that most Sherpas wouldn't know this, as the Sherpa community typically does not celebrate the Dalai Lama's birthday. For Kaesung and her friends, the joke was humorous commentary on Tibetan and Himalayan immigration to North America, on a shared experience of the asylum system, and the political possibilities embedded in the idea of citizenship. As an anthropologist on the alert for a new research project, when I heard the joke for the 5th, 6th, 7th time, I knew this was it. In order to understand why this was happening in Canada, however, we also have to consider the broader context, which is Tibetans' 6 decades of refusing citizenship in South Asia, the history behind their immigration to the United States, and then often on to Canada, and why the Sherpa man was posing as a Tibetan in the first place. 25 years ago, if you drove or walked past the US Embassy in Kathmandu, you would have seen a long queue of people lined up outside it on some days. Many of them were Tibetan, and as gossip went, some of those in line were pretending they were Tibetan. They were young Takali or Manangi or Sherpa men, some of whom had shaved their heads, donned maroon robes, and pretended to be monks based on a perceived notion of Tibetan desirability that they hoped would get them a rare US visa. One day in 1998, Kaesang and I stood in the queue with a friend. We calmed her nerves by talking about the embassy official everyone referred to as Mr. David. Supposedly, he was a Buddhist and he liked Tibetans. And so if you were a Tibetan or successfully convinced embassy staff that you were one, your chances of receiving a visa were believed to be good. Sought after in this process was a tourist visa, which one would enter the United States and stay beyond its expiration with the intention of somehow, some way, securing a job in the USA so that you could send money home to your family. After several hours of waiting outside the embassy, our friend emerged victorious. She had received a visa. Although none of us knew it back in that day, on 1998, almost 20 years later, both she and Kaesang would be living in Toronto as Canadian citizens. In this span of time, a major shift happened in the Tibetan refugee community, with thousands of individuals migrating from South Asia to North America. That first visit that I made to Toronto wasn't only about jokes. There was also serious reflection. All I have are stories, a book of stories. Pepe said this to me as we sat in the Shangri-La Tibetan restaurant in Toronto on a snowy December night in 2007. I had asked about her generation's experiences of emigrating from South Asia to North America. Although she was now a 20-year-old woman, we had known each other since she was a 6-year-old girl in Kathmandu, and I was a young graduate student just beginning my research with the Tibetan refugee community. She and her mother had just moved to Canada, and I was visiting them there for the first time. Again, this is in 2007. Our bellies full of Shabda Tingmo and Alupingsha, we left the restaurant and walked back to her apartment where her mother, Kaesang, was waiting for us. We greeted her and settled in around the table. Pepe turned back to our earlier conversation. The issues we are facing are papers, money, and rights, she said. Citizenship papers, money for everything, and the right to protest. Kaesang joined in saying, we didn't have any of those in Nepal. Tibetans didn't have papers, money, or rights there. She, referring to Pepe, was born in Nepal, but couldn't be a citizen. Pepe was not alone in this. For 6 decades, Tibetan refugees have lived in South Asia without citizenship. Tibetans refused citizenship in South Asia to both claim sovereignty in Tibet and to assert political equality and interdependence vis-a-vis the governments of India and Nepal. As Tibetans like Pepe and Kaesang move to North America, their refusal as political practice changes in some ways, though it remains the same in others. For people who have been collectively dispossessed, what does it mean to refuse international norms of citizenship by insisting on a sovereignty that has been lost? In the case of Tibet, refusing citizenship in South Asia is a means of claiming past, present, and future state sovereignty. Tibet was, Tibet is, Tibet will be. This claim challenges globally hegemonic formulas for sovereignty and citizenship. It rejects the idea that the state of Tibet is merely a former political entity, and instead asserts contemporary political legitimacy. Yet what happens to political claims embedded in refusal when refugees become citizens elsewhere? How might refusal be reconfigured to maintain political claims to home and state sovereignty? The seeming contradiction of Tibetan refugees accepting citizenship in North America after decades of refusing it in South Asia demonstrates that hegemonic categories and practices need not be debilitating or total. Tibetans' collective refusal of an externally assigned political status posits a different status in its place. In so doing, it refuses the probable in favor of the possible. So in this paper, I argue that the unfolding history of the Tibetan refugee citizenship, documentation, and migration challenges contemporary norms and possibilities for political status. Tibetans in exile do so first by inhabiting two ostensibly opposed, right, categories, that of refugee and citizen, and they do so second by refusing to accept their sovereignty as past tense. That is, their current status, regardless of whether it is refugee or undocumented or stateless or citizen, rests in a temporality guided as much by a Buddhist sense of impermanence as by an irreverence for international norms. Strategies might change, but the goal remains the same: regaining Tibetan sovereignty in Tibet. So I also want to argue that ethnographic knowledge is vital for understanding experiences of refugees. That is, alongside political, historic, or legal knowledge, for example, ethnography provides us with a unique and complementary way of knowing. Specifically, ethnographic research gives us conceptual insights to life as lived, to how structures feel, to how categories are experienced, and importantly, into worlds of both action and agency, which for so long have been denied to refugees. My research with the Tibetan community spans over 3 decades and involves personal and political commitments, as well as the relationships and ethnographies that are at the heart, relationships and obligations that are at the heart of ethnography. Kaesang and I first met in 1994. You can see us here. This is outside of the airport in Kathmandu. She and I have been close ever since, sharing joys and sorrows over 3 decades in 3 separate countries, including just a few weeks ago. You can see the photo here about a decade ago. We're at Niagara Falls. And then this photo, which was taken in October of this year. My second argument is about refusal as 21st century intervention into possibilities for citizenship and sovereignty. By this, I do not mean the refusal of immigration judges or officials who deny passage, deny recognition, asylum, status to people. Instead, I mean refusal as a willful, conscious political act. To refuse can be generative and strategic, a deliberate move toward one thing, belief, practice, or community, and away from another. The generative aspect of refusal recognizes the sociality of saying no in order to build something different. This affiliative aspect is one of the things that links refusal to resistance, but refusal is not a synonym for resistance. Where resistance involves consciously defying or opposing superiors in a context of differential power relationships between state and society, refusal rejects such a hierarchy. Also rejects subjugation as the position from which action is taken. Instead, refusal reposits relationships as between equals, insisting on equity rather than inequity. And so here, in referring to refusal, I draw on the important research of anthropologist Audra Simpson, for whom refusal is both ethnographic and political, both stance and theory. Simpson is one of the scholars in Indigenous studies leading the way in theorizing refusal. I think here also of the work of scholars such as Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, Kim Tallbear. However, around the same time, we also see refusal being theorized in other fields. We see it in Black studies, and especially in Black feminist studies, with scholars such as Tina Campt, Gina Athena Ulysse, Savannah Shange. We see it in pre-pandemic research on vaccine refusal. And of course, we see it in current research about the pandemic, as well as in contemporary populist politics, such as the January 6th insurrection. We see it in work with conscientious objectors. We see it in research with refugees who reject the norms of the international refugee regime. And this last one, right, is the Tibetan stance, a position enacted in a very specific and unusual political context. In order to understand what is happening with Tibetan immigration in North America, it's important to understand the history of the Tibetan refugee community in South Asia. So in 1949, Mao Zedong's People Liberation Army marched into Tibet. By 1951, had taken over the country. In the mid-1950s, Tibetans began to fight back in eastern Tibet. By 1959, the fighting reached Lhasa, Tibet's capital. The Dalai Lama, Tibet's political and religious leader, escaped into exile in India, and thousands of Tibetans followed him. Once in India, the Dalai Lama's government immediately reconstituted itself. It retains today the uncontested leadership of the Tibetan community. The Tibetan government in exile is a functioning government. It has an elected parliament. It has a court system. It conducts a census. It collects taxes. It runs its own school. It maintains hegemonic practices of belonging. And it is the sole representative of over 140,000 Tibetans resident in India and Nepal, as well as elsewhere around the world. Although citizenship has been debated at different times in exile history, it was in the early 1960s, again in the 1970s, and most recently in the last decade, the exile government has long refused citizenship in South Asia as part of its political claim to Tibet. However, this refusal is complicated. No country in South Asia, not India, not Nepal, not any other South Asian state, are signatories to the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, or to the 1967 protocol, which updated the convention. What is thus typical of many countries is not the norm in South Asia. Applying for and receiving UN-designated convention refugee status sets in motion a series of rights and protections guaranteed by the state, including a path to citizenship rather than a return to a country where one would face political threats. In South Asia, Tibetans are refugees without the opportunity to apply for convention refugee status, whether they are born in Tibet, in India, or in Nepal. As a result, 6 decades of families, multiple generations, live in South Asia as undocumented or underdocumented peoples, right? There is no path to citizenship for them, and this is unusual, right, in the world. One tension of exile sovereignty is that individuals lack identification and life event documents. Tibetans in South Asia hold either fake documents or locally issued old-fashioned ones not widely recognized outside of South Asia, or they have no documents at all. In India, most but not all Tibetans hold renewable foreigners registration certificates, referred to as RCs, and identification certificates, referred to as ICs. In Nepal, the situation is worse, as the government has never had an official program to identify and provide documentation to all Tibetan refugees, although at various points up until 1989, it did issue some documents to some Tibetans. The United Nations High Commission for Refugees Office in Kathmandu assists as a transit facility for Tibetans who have escaped from Tibet and are traveling on to India. So unlike in Palestine, the United Nations does not offer any identity or travel documentation to Tibetans or have any Tibet-specific offices in India or Nepal. The only document available to all Tibetan refugees is the Green Book issued by the exile government, and that is what you can see on the screen now. These are the Green Books. They are shaped like passports, but they cannot be used like one. The history of possibilities for Tibetan citizenship in South Asia is unclear. According to the citizenship laws of both India and Nepal, many Tibetans should qualify for citizenship in each country, either through birth or through an established connection to the country. At several times in exile history, vigorous discussions have taken place as to whether or not Tibetans should seek citizenship. Each time the government has refused, but tensions surround what's perceived to be a differential application of this refusal. As one man in India said to me, the Sikyong, who is the president of the Tibetan government, and all the government ministers have citizenship and the benefits that come with it. Our country is Tibet. We are all fighting for it, but it is the ordinary Tibetans in India and Nepal who make the sacrifice of not having citizenship, end quote. In India, a handful of Tibetans have begun to make claims to citizenship as provided in the Citizenship Act of India. These claims are controversial among Tibetans as well as among Indian government officials. The high courts have approved citizenship for Tibetans, only to have government offices not recognize the court decisions in order to prolong applicants' imperial foreigner status. And again, that foreigner status is something that dates back to the time of British India. Such claims are not possible in Nepal, where Tibetans have no name status and where Chinese political influence has increased greatly since the 1990s. The most recent change in India is the Tibet Rehabilitation Policy of 2014. In this policy, the government of India claimed the right to terminate Tibetans' leases and other government grants, stating, here's a direct quote, "The Tibetans in India are considered refugees, and they are staying temporarily in India on humanitarian grounds," end quote. The conservative exile government publicly claims neutrality on citizenship for Tibetans in India, stating it is a personal decision for people to make. Privately, however, everyone knows you are not supposed to apply for citizenship. Privately, people know that to do so could cause problems. What happens, therefore, when Tibetans leave South Asia? What does refusal look like in countries where undocumented status is neither allowed nor advised? What options do communities have when convention refugee status is not a possibility? Section 134 of the U.S. Immigration Act of 1990 authorized the one-time immigration of 1,000, in quotes, displaced Tibetans to the USA. They were chosen by lottery, and their families allowed to join them in the US after 5 years had passed. This first group of Tibetan immigrants paved the way for additional groups whose imagination was triggered by the first. Following this official migration program, in the late 1990s, large numbers of individual Tibetans began to migrate to North America on tourist visas. Most flew into and stayed in New York City, especially in Queens. And here you see a piece of art by the artist Sodun from 2014. Unlike the first official group, however, the later second and third unofficial groups had nothing waiting for them except for Tibetan friends and family members. Without citizenship and working papers, they found only certain jobs were available, and over time realized they needed citizenship. However, how do you acquire citizenship in a new country? Each country's rules on this are different. In the United States, one way you might gain citizenship is via political asylum. The US government declares 5 groups of people eligible for asylum: those who have suffered persecution or feel they will suffer persecution due to race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Not all Tibetans meet those qualifications, so not all qualify for political asylum in the USA. Instead, they formed a new type of citizenship migration to Canada. They have made a path from New York City to Toronto via Buffalo and Niagara Falls. Go to Buffalo, everyone says. You have to go to Buffalo. In 2005, Kason phoned me in Colorado one morning from New England. "I need help," she said. "I need to go to Buffalo." She knew I had a good friend in Toronto who had made his way there via Buffalo. "Can you call him and get the information?" she asked me. I did, and he gave me detailed instructions. And I'm going to read them now to you verbatim. "Take the Greyhound bus from New York City," he said. "At the bus station in Buffalo, get a taxi to Viva La Casa. The taxi drivers all know this place. It should be $10 for the fare. This is a missionary shelter where she will be taken care of by volunteers who will help her fill out the asylum forms." "Does she speak English?" he asked me. "No," I said. "Then tell her to go with a friend. Bring her green book, her Rangzin book, and Nepali passport. The story is that she bought the passport, that she's not really a Nepali citizen. It's true," he said, "but it's still hard to explain." Tibetans go to Buffalo to go to Canada. But why Canada? Why are Tibetans going to Canada rather than staying in the US? The answer is simple. In Canada, assessments for asylum are reckoned differently, with tribunals determining or not whether Tibetans qualify for convention refugee status, not for political asylum. Overall, Tibetans have been deemed eligible. One thus appears before a judge or tribunal with the need to convince them that you are indeed a bona fide Tibetan. All true or bona fide Tibetans immediately qualify for citizenship in Canada, as well as for employment assistance, English language courses, free healthcare, and more. And of course, any bona fide Tibetan would know the exact date of the Dalai Lama's birthday. Okay. In the 1980s, a group of Catholic nuns formed a rest house for refugees fleeing war in Central America, from Guatemala, from El Salvador, from Honduras. At the rest house, they provided shelter, meals, and clothing for the refugees. But that was not all. They also provided free legal assistance in preparing one's asylum application for Canada, submitted all the necessary papers and information to the Canadian government, and then drove refugees directly to the US-Canada border once all of their documents were in place. The nuns named this rest house Viva La Casa. On the day I arrived at Viva La Casa, my first meeting was with the director. He and I spoke for a while about my research. Then he said, "Let's go see how many Tibetans are here today." He explained there were 118 beds at Viva La Casa, and all were usually full. Normally, he said, anywhere from 1 to 10 of those beds are occupied by Tibetans. "I've worked here for 4 years. We've had dozens of Tibetans. They are the nicest people." End quote. We went to see the assistant director, to whom he introduced me, and then he asked her, "Who are our Tibetans this week?" She paused a second and then in surprise said, "There are no Tibetans here right now. One man just left for Canada this morning. He was alone, and now there are no Tibetans in the house." End quote. Together, they marveled at this fact that there were no Tibetans at Viva La Casa that morning. And they reassured me that, in quotes, "In recent memory, there hasn't been a time when there were no Tibetans at Viva." So you can see here is one of the rooms where people stay while they are waiting for their papers to be processed. Here you have a room for children, and you can see kids as well as volunteers, lots of very bright and fun things to do here. And here's something that was mentioned to me numerous times by people I spoke with in Toronto, the murals at Viva and the importance of flags. And you can see down at the very bottom of the E there in the corner of the E is the Tibetan flag. All the staff members had stories of Tibetans who had stayed there, and almost every Tibetan in Toronto had a story of staying at Viva. They remembered particular staff members, or cooking food, or painting murals, or picking out clothes in the donation room before departing for Canada. They remembered also the other refugees there from around the world. Viva La Casa director Peter Murrell showed me the registration books for a 4-day period that month. In this period, mostly individuals, but sometimes whole families, had arrived from Bangladesh, Colombia, Congo, El Salvador, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Nicaragua, Pakistan, Peru, Sri Lanka, Trinidad and Tobago, Zimbabwe, and Tibet. "There's a constant stream of people coming in," said Peter, "and usually 5 to 12 people going to Canada each day. I say goodbye to them on the morning they depart, and I say, I hope I never see you again. In other words, may your asylum application be successful." But once at the border, right, how does one prove that you are actually Tibetan? And what does it mean to be Tibetan? Per the Canadian government, it means one is a Tibetan refugee associated with the Dalai Lama and the Central Tibetan Administration in exile. It means one possesses a green book, speaks Tibetan, and can narrate or otherwise perform a convincing Tibetan identity. Tibetans have their own ideas about what will best display their Tibetanness. And of course, their ideas do not always converge with those held by Canadian attorneys and tribunals. "Speak Tibetan and wear a chuba, for God's sake," one attorney told me he advised Tibetan clients. And a chuba, as you can see here, is a form of Tibetan dress. You see here 2 elderly women in Toronto. This is in Parkdale, the Tibetan neighborhood. The striped aprons they have over their chuba signify that they are married women, but a form of national dress immediately recognizable. However, not just for the elderly. And here you can see, this is at the weekly Wednesday Hakar Gorshe in Toronto. Lots of every single person dancing in this photograph is wearing a chuba. So you can see anyone who has that striped apron over signifying married women, the rest would be unmarried women. However, this is also a gender neutral form of dress. So here, more specifically, you can see some men also wearing the chuba. And a couple people, some have it up over their shoulders, some have it folded it down. Again, national dress throughout Tibet. Many Tibetans who speak English well use a translator when they go before the judge. Some have told me of the experience of the Tibetan English translator not being as fluent in English as they are. They listen to their well-crafted answers in Tibetan be translated into a broken English, nuances lost, details omitted, their deep answers rendered shallow by the translator. Tibetans who do not speak English tell different stories, both of anxiety and anticipation. A shared concern all have is with what sort of stories one is supposed to tell the judge. As a young woman explained to me in Queens, we don't want to lie, but feel compelled to. This is not, she insisted, because Tibetans are dishonest, but because they are told they need to embellish their stories. Her husband added, maybe they don't really need to do that, but they hear that they do. The belief that asylum seekers lie circulates globally, making refugees banal figures of distrust. In New York City, Tibetans have been placed on the list of refugees who have known stories. In The New Yorker, author Suketu Mehta quotes an immigration attorney who explains to him, direct quote, "The immigration people know all the stories. There's one for each country. There's the Colombia rape story. They all say they were raped by FARC. There's the Rwanda rape story, the Tibetan refugee story. The details for each are the same," end quote. In Toronto, one attorney implied to me that Tibetan stories are often seen as tame in comparison to those of others. Direct quote, "Some tribunal members hate Tibetan cases because they come in after a Rwandan guy with one arm," end quote. How can Tibetan suffering compete? And how does one operate in a system that allows suffering to be competitive or that disqualifies individuals because of consonance in their experiences? Many Tibetans do tell the truth in asylum court. Numerous individuals shared with me that they told their actual story against other advice they received, or that they spoke English rather than Tibetan. As one attorney in Toronto told me, "Tibetans don't need to lie here," end quote. Kaesong's story didn't surprise me at all. Her strategy was to answer the judge's questions as honestly as possible. She says, "I told him I threw my fake Nepali passport into the river. I wanted to get rid of it as fast as possible. Then he asked me about Tibetan culture, and I told him I was in a dance troupe when I was younger. I did one of the dances for him right in the courtroom. Oh, I told him everything and I danced. We were laughing and he approved my refugee status." So the photo you now see is of a dance troupe that Kaesong was in back in Kathmandu. She is third one from the left, wearing the green chuba with a purple shirt underneath. So in the end, there is no punchline to the joke about the Sherpa man and the Dalai Lama's birthday. Although that story was from Toronto, similar stories circulate in New York City and throughout the Tibetan diaspora. The story about the US embassy official in New Delhi who asked the non-Tibetan posing as a monk to take off his monk's robes and retie him. And of course, as everyone listening to this story knew, the man couldn't do it. The story about the asylum officer who never asks about actual political persecution, but asks instead if the petitioner knows what the Four Noble Truths are. As if this was Toronto rather than New York City, says a Tibetan man in Queens. And the tale about the asylum officer who always says no, who says there is no Tibet, Tibet is a part of China, and who never grants asylum, no matter how gruesome, how devastating, or how true one story is. Our research needs to recognize the conditions and meet the needs of the current political moment. This is so for our research topics, our methods, our theories. Quantitative research and also qualitative research needs to be paired with ethnography and vice versa. Together, we can see both big picture and finer grained detail, large structures and histories, as well as the lived everyday experience, kind of both wide-angled, right, and zoomed-in views. Ethnography is not just another qualitative method. It is more than that. It is also epistemology, and in that, it is theory. One theory grown from ethnographic seeds is refusal. Refusal is insistence on the possible over the probable. And here I think of Isabel Stenger's insight that if we follow probability, there is no hope, just a calculated anticipation authorized by the world as it is. Hope combines with will to refuse such authorized anticipations, thus moving away from the probable into the possible. This does not happen only in courtrooms or immigration lines, but also in everyday life. It is about joking and friendship, about recalibrating new experiences to find affordances and attunements to long-standing ways of being, of knowing, of interacting. It is as likely to take place on sidewalks and in apartments as in attorneys' offices. Refusal is a form of hope. And Canada, over the last 15 years, I have again and again experienced this as the remaking of Canadian places as Tibetan places and vice versa. And so in conclusion, I want to take you to an iconic Canadian landmark. So here we are in Tim Hortons. One summer day, Kaesung and I went to Tim Hortons, the ubiquitous Canadian donut and coffee shop in Jameson. She said she wanted coffee. There's better coffee down the street, I said, thinking of Capital Espresso, down near Parkdale Community Legal Services, a building I knew well, where some of the attorneys with whom I work on asylum and family reunification bases were based, and where signs and pamphlets were printed in numerous languages and put up on the wall and available on counters, including in the Tibetan language. A lifelong tea drinker, Kaesung said back to me, I don't really care about the coffee. I want to see who is there. Continuing, she said, Tim Hortons is like Korra at Boda. I see everyone I know there. For Tibetans who live near the Boda Chorten, pictured here in Kathmandu, doing Korra, or circumambulation, a form of walking meditation, around the Chorten in the morning or afternoon, or sometimes both, is a social activity as much as a religious activity. It is a main part of the day for people. Kaesung laughed as she said this, saying, there is nowhere to do Korra in Jameson. Instead, she said, people go to Tim Hortons to see who is already there and to hope that someone you know will come out as you are going in. The following spring, I was in Jameson again and stopped by the Tim Hortons on my own. 2 older men were coming out, 2 young Tibetan women were going in. They saw a friend approaching and they called out to her, Ta tunkasho, come and drink tea. So, come and drink tea. This is the practice of refugee citizenship. This is refusal as possibility still unfolding in this world. Thank you.
So maybe we can start with questions from the audience.
First inspired you to start working with like the Tibetan community, shelter in South Asia or in Canada in general?
I get asked that question a lot. Thank you for that. So when I was in college, I wanted to study abroad, and I had never left the United States before. And I learned of a study abroad program to Nepal. And I remember it's the first line said, Nepal is a country of superlatives. And it went on to talk about the country as this, from sea level to the top of Mount Everest, Hinduism, Buddhism, 40 different languages spoken in a country the size of Tennessee, basically. And I was captivated and decided to go there and did. And in the very first weeks of the program, they took us, so we were a group of maybe 20 US college students, up to a village close to the border with Tibet. So for anyone who's familiar with Nepal, we were in Marpa, which is just south of Jomsom, which is just south of Mustan. And we lived there with families and studied the Nepali language. So we stayed there for 2 weeks. Right below, kind of 10-minute walk from the village of Marpa, was a Tibetan refugee camp. And this was on a trekking route. And the way you trek in Nepal is where you go hiking from village to village and stay with families each night in guest house. Well, back in the day, now you might just stay in a little hotel. And you never spent really more than one night in a place, and traveling usually in small groups. So because we were staying and we were a group of students learning to speak Nepali, we became a tourist attraction, right? So people would come to see this strange group of American students, right, who were living in the village and learning to speak Nepali. And what the Tibetan men and women told me who came, and they would come each day to hang out, in the afternoon, drink tea and just chat, changed the whole course of my life. So again, I was 20 years old at the time, and they told me they had lost their country and that they couldn't go back. At the time, there was no way to make a phone call or to send a letter to Tibet. So the men and women I was talking to said, we left behind our parents and our brothers and sisters and friends and grandparents. And this had been 30 years since they had left. They had no communication at all with their family. And that alone blew my mind, right? At the time, there was one place you could make a phone call in Kathmandu, but I could go there and pay money and call my parents if I wanted to. So that was important, but it had never occurred to me you could lose your country, right? And for anyone in this room who works in the field of refugee studies, that is often the position that most refugees are in, right? It also hadn't occurred to them necessarily, like at that initial moment that they were going to become refugees, or even that after the initial becoming a refugee, that they weren't going to be going back to a renewed and safe landscape in just a matter of months. And so I wanted to know, well, what happened and why, and why don't I know about this? And so that was the start of me trying to learn what had happened, to educate myself and to share that story with others. And here I am, 30 years later. Tibetans now can make phone calls and can maybe send some packages. Everything is heavily surveilled though and censored, so you have to be very careful, but there is at least communication now between families. But for the first 3 decades, there was none at all. And imagine living with that, right? What would it be like to live your life like that, not knowing the fate of your family, not being able to just check in? Think of how connected we are with cell phones now, and how many times, think of the people you connect with every single day through your phone or some sort of, digital, form of technology, even if you don't see them face to face, right? What would it be like to live without that and without knowing? So that's how I got started. It made a big impression on me.
Thank you so much. I have a little bit more specific questions.
Sure.
Based in India and what you were saying about like resident citizenship, or resident citizens, and how that sort of process of applying for that works, and like who gets that, and also have you encountered people who have obtained like Indian citizenship?
So yes, and as that one man said, right, the Tibetan government officials had it because they had to be able to travel internationally, right? And some of them, I think, also appreciated the perks that came with it, right? Like the rights that you do have. If you have a passport, or in this country, right, a driver's license, right? Those markers, those documents of citizenship rights come with it. If you are stateless, with no documentation, you literally have 0 rights, right? Convention refugee status gives you some rights, again, but not available to Tibetans in India. So an RC or an IC, registration certificates, and I can give you the details later. There are specific thresholds, like if you or your parents came here before a certain date. So there are certain things like that you have to go by. So many Tibetans, but not all, do have these in India. Foreigners registration certificates require renewing annually. So you have to go. It often requires also paying bribes, right, to get that work done, or traveling to wherever the nearest office is that is going to renew this for you. So in Nepal, it's not that way. In India, there are forms of documentation. These are not necessarily recognized outside of India. So the Indian government will issue a travel kind of visa or travel stamp on your identity certificate. And actually in the longer version of this talk, I think maybe I cut too much, seems like we have a lot of time left. I talk about a Tibetan woman in Toronto who traveled to Europe on this Indian government issued identity certificate that had a stamp on it saying she could travel internationally. And she said she landed in Europe and the immigration officials made fun of her. We're calling people over to look at this, and she just felt this sense of shame. And so some of the conversations I've had with her are about how she wants to impart secure citizenship and a sense of security and safety for her children, right? So that they don't go through what it is she's gone through. But the difference, kind of just to fully pull in the idea of refusal then between, say, her experience in India and her experience now in Canada, right, where she has received citizenship, not refused it, right? So refusing citizenship for Tibetans in India has allowed them for a very long time now, right? It's been 63 years, right, to argue that they are not accepting citizenship in India or Nepal because they are citizens of Tibet. Right? It's just Tibet is colonized right now by China, right? So they can't, can't activate to realize that citizenship in that way, but it's kind of this deferral, right? So you might say, okay, well then if you take citizenship in the USA or Canada or, France or Switzerland or all these other countries, right, that don't allow you to live in an undocumented status for multiple generations, how does that impact your claim to Tibet? And so the argument that is made is that it enables us to fight for that claim, right? It enables us to fight for that Tibetan citizenship. So in essence, it's a form of dual citizenship as I understand it, right? It's the acquiring of Canadian citizenship or of American citizenship is not the loss or denial, or forfeiture of Tibetan citizenship, but it's now a dual sort of thing, right? Like now with the backing of not just a US or Canadian passport, but also that security, right? And the lack of shame, the lack of stigma, the ability to act in a new way. And so that's why I had that line about it's kind of the goal is the same, like the argument shifts, right? So in Refusal has that malleability, right? In terms of what are the political needs of the moment, right? And why is it perhaps this is, arising now?
I've been such an avid reader of most of your texts. It's such a privilege and delight to be able to hear you in person. So thank you so much for making this happen. I actually wanted to, I have two sort of questions about refusal as both a concept and as a practice. And I really appreciate how you're building on and sort of also taking diverse directions, the existing feminist scholarship on refusal. So I wanted you, if you could speak to one, which is as an ethnographer yourself, what is your entry point into refusal in your own position as an ethnographer who's sustained these relationships, maintained them, committed to them for so many years now? So do you, are you approaching them entirely from, the perspective of who are doing this kind of refusal work? Or are you also as an ethnographer participative in it, against it, within, despite it? So that's one question I would like to answer. And secondly, within these communities of exile or refugiehood, refugiedom, or in places outside Tibet, are there sort of conflicts about that refusal, whether it is gendered or about positions of class, like within the communities itself? What are the kinds of contestations about refusal if they're acknowledging it as sort of one practice? Yeah, those two things. Thank you so much.
So starting with the first, let's go in order. So back to refusal as a stance, right, as well as a theory. And not everyone might be fully familiar with the work, but so this is really drawing on the work of Audra Simpson, who I mentioned, for whom ethnographic refusal is not just the study of refusal as a political practice by a community, but also an option of the scholar, right, to not disclose certain ethnographic details or stories or even arguments, right, that those must be held. And she posits this as not just the sort of decisions we all have to make as authors, right, in writing, right? You can't put everything in, so you choose to leave some stuff out. This is not that, right? This is, again, a willful, conscious decision to leave out things that a reader would expect, right? That scholarship would demand, that people expect to know based on the research you did, that you say, I'm not going to tell you. Right? I'm not just going to give you the information that ethnography or whatever your field is, political science, history, right, sociology, has historically demanded, right, to know based on research. So that just to share with folks who aren't familiar with Audra's work. For me, historically, I have worked with refusal as a practice of the community because that's where I first encountered it. And originally I wasn't doing research on this. It was just kept coming up again and again, right? Even before I started the research on asylum, that I was so struck by the way that people I interacted with consistently used the word, we refused it. Like that was the term they used when they were talking about citizenship and speaking in the collective, right? Not speaking individually. So I came to it that way. And that was initially the way that I used it. Familiar with Audra's work, familiar with the idea of refusal as ethnographic stance. But for me, that has only come very recently. And I'll just quickly share the story of how I've used ethnographic refusal in my research, because I do think it's relevant. And that is just in this last year. So 1 year ago, actually it was November 2021, I gave a lecture at the AAA's in Baltimore, in which I told the story of a woman, right? It was kind of the ethnographic biography of one person, and someone who had been a difficult personality, who had lived a difficult and a very sad life. And I told her story. Right? Maybe a couple things left out, not necessarily for ethnographic refusal, more for respect and for care. And I had told her story. She had recently passed away, in conjunction with her family. So her family knew I was telling her story and had worked with me on. They hadn't read it because they didn't want to, but they knew I was doing this. Afterwards, as I was preparing this lecture for publication and was, finalizing it, and you might know just how long this all takes, right? Like to come up with a, long research talk, to convert it to an article. I stumbled across a photo of this woman that I had forgotten about, and I sent it to someone in her family, like, oh, look, I just found this old photo of so-and-so. And that person, something in that photo triggered something in her. And she wrote back to me, and then we talked, and she said, I don't want this story to be out in the world anymore. And can you please not write it? I wrote back immediately and said, I will not tell this. I mean, I can tell the story of not telling the story, right? But I said, if you don't want me to tell this story, I won't. And I'm not going to. And I'll make that promise to you. And I had already presented it publicly. It was already up online, right, as a video. Lots of people had watched it. Lots of people had been in the audience. And I contacted, it was AES. So it was AES had put it up. It was the distinguished lecture for AES. The video was up, and I said, I need you to take down the video. And the article was due in like 2 days. And I wrote to the editors of the journal, and I said, I'm really sorry. I was going to be ready to send it to you, but I can't send this to you now, and I need to take some time to rethink this. I was scheduled to give a talk on it in California. I had to contact those people. And I said, I can't come present this talk, and I need to regroup and see if I have anything to present to you. I took a week to just kind of ponder it and think about what to do. And I ended up coming up with a plan, how I could, what happens, that her story was the heart of the talk I had given. And I had to go deep into my notes, like into my field notes, going back decades, as well as into my relationships myself. And I did find stories to tell. And so the article now exists. If you can go and read it, it came out in August in AE. But that, and the article, it's called Theory as Ethics, is this particular article. It was about this theory from ethnography. It was about relationships being at the heart of what we do, right? And what does it mean to not tell a story that the discipline, right, would expect me to tell? And actually, so when I did go to California and I presented it to an interdisciplinary audience, and I kind of shared, like as I'm doing now, afterwards, I had someone tell me, you could have told the story anyways of that woman, right? Just not getting it. Not understanding the ethics of what it means to refuse to tell something that's been trusted to you, because it would cause pain in the world, because someone else doesn't need to know, right? What is our right to know? So, second question, refresh my memory, and then sorry, that was a long answer. You didn't know what you were asking when you.
Yeah. The second one was about contestations within the community on refusal.
Oh, very few. The Tibetan community is incredibly united. There's not so much contestation as there is, frankly, jealousy. So folks inside India, especially in India, hold tight to the not gaining citizenship. Nepal, again, was never an issue. So it's not like you could have one opinion one way or the other, whereas in India, there is an active conversation on it. It's more, now there's a wistfulness. Oh, look at those Tibetans in X country who have it. And then you have folks perhaps say like, in Sunnyside or Long Island City, right? Saying, oh, back in India, we had the following, and there's wistfulness and nostalgia over senses of community and things that were positive about that, right? So there's ways, again, there's refusals in wanting to cross certain lines, right? But that is very much a discourse within the Tibetan community. What does it mean to be united? What does it mean to have an active political struggle? And the community is incredibly united on that. So. You had your hand up as well.
Yes, thank you. Very fascinating talk. Thank you. Two quick questions also. So one is about roots. I'm interested in, I can see that Viva La Casa is a very central node in this move from America to Canada. But are they also moving into Canada straight from
No.
from South Asia, or does it have to go
They all come in through the United States.
Right. And why is that the case? That
Because this is independent, this is individual immigration. So recently there was a citizen organized Canadian government approved immigration plan to bring over a group of Tibetans from Arunachal Pradesh. So that group came in directly from India. And same as the group of 1,000 I was talking about before that took place in the United States, right? They came in, they had a plan, they had people waiting for them, Canadian citizens, many of whom were Tibetan Canadian citizens, right? Jobs, so that sort of thing. That's a group organized immigration and authorized by the government. This is different. These are individual people appearing at the border petitioning, right, for asylum. And so to do that, you cannot do that at a high commission. It's same for the United States as for Canada. You can't go to a US embassy around the world and request asylum. You can only request that either at the border when you're entering or once you're in country, right? There's a period of time for which you can.
And then related to that, your argument about refusal, is it that they are refusing citizenship in South Asia, or are you arguing that they are refusing the status of being undocumented and unregulated in South Asia, or is it a possibility of getting citizenship? So I'm not entirely clear, but it's because I don't know much about the specific context, whether you're arguing they're refusing citizenship in South Asia, in India, or the status of not being documented and regulated.
They're refusing citizenship. So since 1959, so now we're on third, even fourth generation of Tibetans have lived in India with either, again, it's not just undocumented or under, right? Because some of them do have these government of India issued documentations that are good only in India. The question for me actually is, what were they offered? And the details of this have never been made public, either for His Holiness the Dalai Lama's relationships, it was with Nehru in the 1950s, or with the King of Nepal in the 1950s, where Tibetans offered citizenship. That I don't know for sure, because again, I don't have access to the agreements that were made. The way that the Tibetans publicly and privately speak is that we refused it. So it's not a protest of being undocumented, right? It's an acceptance of that, but positing it as we are refusing citizenship, regardless of whether or not it's offered to us. Again, per the Constitution of India, many Tibetans qualify for citizenship. However, the government of India also doesn't recognize this. Believe me, I have to explain this all the time to judges in Canada and the United States. So they're like, well, look, right here in the Constitution, a Tibetan would qualify. I'm like, I understand it says that and it looks that way, but that is not the practice, which again is why, ethnography and lived experience is as important, if not more important sometimes than what a law says, right? Because actual experience does not correspond here with what the legal documents say should happen.
There are two questions.
Okay.
So one is that as we got to know about the 1951 Refugee Convention, the question that they're asking is why the refugee laws came just after World War II, but not just after the 1940s. And can we look at that act as something politically driven? It's a general question about the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Okay. I'm not sure if the question is for the world in general or for South Asia. I mean, the answer for both is yes, right? I mean, the formulation of refugee laws and of UNHCR following World War II, right, was an attempt to solve what was seen as, the crisis of refugees and stateless peoples in the world following World War II. I feel like this is stuff many people know. And the agreement among countries that every piece of territory had to be associated to a nation state. Right, so there couldn't be a patch of land that somehow was independent of some state, and that is where international refugee law comes from. In South Asia, the decision not to sign on, again, as a collectivity, right, as as a group of states, clearly was a political decision that they have held to, ever since. So to whoever is asking, the answer is yes. What that means for refugees in South Asia, if you recall the statement that I read from the Tibetan Policy Act, is the government of India considers Tibetans refugees. Right, so per government of India terminology, they are refugees, but that does not align them with UN Convention refugee status, which is then a shared series of rights or set of rights that are supposed to be upheld, right, by countries around the world that are actionable. This is a different type of thing.
Yeah, Shreya, go ahead.
In the book, you talk about the journeys of the Tibetan refugees through Nepal and Arunachal and their encounter with different religions, different cuisine, and sort of how that experience to move for them was like a world expanding experience culturally. And I was struck by that when you were talking about the Tim Horton as the stupa and stuff like that. And I was wondering specifically what have you observed, or what have the people you've spoken with observed about themselves in terms of social rules, attitudes, behaviors that remain sticky for them as it was when they lived at home, versus after all of these years of living in a different place and navigating different cultures? And this could be in respect to gender, or even eating or socializing or whatever that is.
I guess two things. One, Tibetans are incredibly cosmopolitan. So Tibetans live in multiple countries around the world, as well as, the bulk of Tibetans still to this day live inside Tibet as part of the People's Republic of China. And each year, more and more Tibetans, come from Tibet outside, especially for education. And so there's lots of movement. This is a community that, while for a long time was very much only in Asia, for the last 20 years has become really, truly an international diaspora. So that sense of cosmopolitanism, whereas if we think of what was it that enabled China, what was one of the things anyways that enabled China to take over Tibet, right, to just march right in and invade, was Tibet didn't have diplomatic relations with any countries except for Nepal. Right. So, it was the opposite of a cosmopolitan country, right? It was very much insulated, inward focused, looking at Buddhism. It had not yet entered, right, the world of modern diplomacy in terms of building relationships with other countries. And so there were no countries who then had those sort of diplomatic obligations, right, to step in. So there's that. But in thinking specifically about South Asia, right, which is where Tibetans came into 1959, and really up until the year 2000, the overwhelming majority, right, of Tibetans in exile were in South Asia. One of the big things I think that has been overlooked, it has been a conservatism in gender expression and roles, right? So actually a shrinking of possibilities for women. And I think that is something that has emerged from coming into a society dominated by kind of Hindu and Muslim Moors, right? And a much more conservative public profile for women than what Tibetans had experienced prior to that. That's something I've thought about. No one, to my knowledge, has actively researched it. But that's one thing, right? What does it mean to come into a different society, right? Where rules for even just what parts of the body need to be covered when you appear in public, what's considered, decorous or not, right? For a woman, to how she comports herself in public, things like that. So South Asia has been very influential on the Tibetan community. Anyone who grew up there, can probably sing and dance any number of Bollywood songs going all the way back, decades. So there's the influences that are beloved, right? And that are charming and that are fun, culinary influences as well. And then there's the ones that fly a little bit lower under the surface, I think, such as this conservatism. Not that Tibet wasn't a conservative society earlier, but I think it manifested itself in new ways in exile, and gender, I believe, is one of them.
Here's one more question.
We have one more questions. John, if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes. In the 1960s, one of the first groups of Tibetans to leave South Asia went to Switzerland. Do you know what happened to those people and how much of a Tibetan presence there is in Switzerland today?
I do. They are still there. So until very recently, Switzerland, you're right, had the longest standing, kind of oldest Tibetan community. It was kind of Switzerland and the UK, although the number of Tibetans in the UK was also always much smaller than the number of Switzerland. So it's a thriving community now, and it's now a community, and Tibetans actually are kind of throughout from Geneva, all sorts of cities in Switzerland, centered in the Zurich area and cantonments in that part of the country. But now is a community that, kind of like the community in India and Nepal, is three generations deep. So fully, younger generations fully immersed into Swiss life, whether it's Swiss French or Swiss German, and a very successful community as well. So just prior to the pandemic, I was working I was going to be adding France and Switzerland to my study of refugee citizenship around the world. And I planned on spending the summer of 2020, half in Paris and half in Zurich. And then the situation changed. But so I'm hoping to go back. So very active community there, but a community that is now truly Swiss, right? As well as Tibetan, yet maintaining active ties to Tibetans around the world, right? There's no Tibetan, I can't think of any Tibetan friend of mine or colleague I know who doesn't have family members in multiple countries around the world, right? So my Swiss friends, Swiss Tibetan friends, have relatives in DC and relatives in Delhi and family still inside Tibet. An important country for Tibetans, because Tibetans have been residents there since the early 60s. Again, one of those first places outside of South Asia, and still an active and vibrant community.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You want to close it or? All right.
That's the question.
Oh, great. I've been thinking about both your and Audra's concept of refusal as sort of historically contingent modes of agency that are made, right, differentially available to different people. And I was struck by essentially what you said essentially in the global South, in South Asia, the refusal is available as because being undocumented and underdocumented is a possibility of life.
Right.
Whereas in the global North, where it is not, refusal looks different. And so then I think with Catherine Besterman's sort of militarized global apartheid, and I'm wondering how the Tibetan sort of situation and this sort of different modes of agency or different modes of refusal co-articulate with this militarized global apartheid, to also bring in your wonderful book, Arrested Histories, which deals with the CIA history and so forth. But yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, articulates it. And I think what comes to me initially is not from my own research, but from Audra. So the scholar we're referring to, Audra Simpson, has a book called Mohawk Interruptus. And one of the things she talks about in this book is not just her own crossing of the US-Canadian border, but of the Mohawk, the Iroquois national lacrosse team, right, traveling to South America and insisting on using their Iroquois Nation passports and then trying to come back into, so they're received, they can go to South America on those, but when they try to come back in, right, and what does it mean to say, right, and they of course also, right, have a US or have a Canadian passport. What does it mean to say, I'm not going to use that one, right? I think this gets into it, right, like who is allowed to make what choices, who is allowed to refuse what, and this is why refusal, I think, as so many of us are articulating it, is different than resistance.
Right.
Resistance requires that relationship of subjugation, right? It unfolds in a landscape that's unequal, right? Subordination is part of resistance. You are pushing back. Refusal is more, is a horizontal relationship. Like, I have a US passport, I'm not going to use it, right? I'm going to insist, right, on using this other passport. And what does it take? This is back to that Tibetan woman, right, who felt the shame and the stigma of showing up that, like, what does it take to have that sort of sensibility, to be able to refuse publicly when facing a security officer, right? Like, what are the stakes? What are the repercussions? When can you make that move and when can you not, right? Because there certainly are some situations in which that is not an option. right? And resistance might not be either, right, in certain states, but I would say absolutely similar things with deep resonance. Yeah.
It's helpful because on the cyclical question of agency that keeps coming every 20, 30 years, concepts like refusal help us provide a topography of different modes of, right? That is not, do these people have agency or don't they, right? So thank you for that.
Oh, for sure. Well, thank you all, and thank you folks who are watching online. Yeah, glad you're all here.